So tonight I have the pleasure, the real pleasure, of being joined by Dr. Ken Paller, a professor of psychology at Northwestern University and director of the training program in the neuroscience of human cognition. And from Dr. Paller's lab, we have Karen Konkoly, who is a third year PhD student, and she leads the lucid dreaming project that we will be exploring. Dr. Paller and Ms. Konkoly were finalists in our inaugural 2018 Brainstorm Neuroscience Pitch Competition, where they pitched their work on two-way communication with lucid dreamers. Dreams have fascinated humankind for millennia. We welcome Dr. Paller and Ms. Konkoly to give their special insight on the nature of dreams. And I'm going to switch to calling you Ken because you said I could.
Yes, please do.
So, Ken, how do we know about what happens while we're asleep?
Well, let me just put my slides up and we'll start to talk about that. I'm also gonna, one other little thing while I do this is I like to see you. So now I can see you on my screen. That's good. So I wanted to start by thanking the Mind Science Foundation, of course, for supporting us when we proposed this project. We didn't know if it would work for sure. And we'll tell you today it did work. So we're very happy to tell you about that. You know, this question about what happens during sleep, I think, Miriam, we should start from the first person perspective. So, you know, what do you feel when you've had a good night's sleep? Well, that would be nothing. You close your eyes and you wake up and it's like, you know, your brain was off that whole time and you feel good after a nice night of sleep. Other nights, maybe we don't feel quite the same. You might realize you had a bad night of sleep. You might think you periodically woke up. In fact, we do periodically wake up a lot more than we realize, but we don't get a full perspective on what's happening during sleep. And it's really, you know, neuroscience. And when the EEG came on the scene, we learned a lot more about what's happening during sleep because we could see, well, actually the brain isn't off. You know, I have my laptop and if I close the lid, nothing happens and it's sleeping, what is called sleeping. But when we close our own eyelids, our brain is busy the whole time. So things are going on and we can measure that in a number of ways, one of which is using the EEG or the electroencephalogram. And we get these sort of wiggly lines that you can see. And that tells us something about the brain activity that's happening the entire night. And so we look at that and try to figure out what the brain is doing. And we have these other signals, the EOG and the EMG. These signals tell us about eye movements and about muscle activity and inform us about the different stages of sleep. So we know that there's light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, and then a repeat of that cycle, maybe every hour and a half. So a whole set of things that are happening that we don't really realize when we wake up in the morning. We don't know all that's going on. And so we've been looking at that to figure out, well, how is that brain processing important for memory function? That was our one particular question over the last decade or so. And we asked that in a number of ways. I'm going to tell you about one of our experiments that really got a strong handle on it because it showed for sure that sleep can help with memory processing. And it's this method we call targeted memory reactivation. And with this method, we are able to have people learn something. In this experiment, they learned locations of objects. So there was a cat in the lower left. There were like 50 different objects. People studied them repeatedly and learned where each object was located, which is, maybe that's analogous to, you know, you have to remember, where did I put the salt? Where did I leave my car keys? Or, you know, where did I park my car? We have to have spatial information. And so this is an example of that. And each object also had a sound, like the cat had a meow. Whenever people saw the cat and learned where it was located, they also heard the meow. And then we could test them and find out, well, how well did they learn these 50 locations? And they learned them quite well, so that in the second part of our experiment, we could have them go to sleep. And they had an app in our laboratory with this whole recording that we call polysomnography. We could see what their brain activity was, and we could know when they were in the stage of deep sleep, which turns out to be at least one of the important times when memories are processed. And we know that because we presented half of the sounds, like the meow sound, very quietly, didn't wake people up, but we know that the sounds got in because of what we found out in the third part of the experiment, where we tested their memory again. And they had to decide where each of those objects were located. And what we found is for the half of the objects that we cued, their memory was better. And this shows that in a graph, less forgetting for the locations of the objects for which the sound was presented. So we didn't make them better at remembering the sounds, but the only conclusion from these results that the cued memories were better than the uncued memories without a sound is that the sounds must have got in and have been processed to the level of reactivating the memory for the cat and its location. And the location was not forgotten as much as the other locations. So therefore, reactivating memories during sleep leads to better performance when you wake up. And we have sort of other evidence that sort of fills in this story and makes it clear that memory activation does happen commonly during sleep. I'll tell you a couple ones more because, well, it's not just locations of objects, first off, but other types of memories like skills and habits are important. And here's one of the fun skill tests we used. It's the Guitar Hero game, essentially. And I play keyboards myself. So this is like playing keyboards on a keyboard. And you can see the 4 fingers are moving there. And whenever one of those circles passes up to this white circle, that's when the person has to press the corresponding button. And if they do, they get to hear that cute little melody. And they can learn melodies this way and get better at it as the task gets harder. People learn 2 melodies. What do we do? Well, same kind of experiment, except this time while they were in slow wave sleep, we presented one of the melodies randomly. When they woke up, the results, as you see here, they were better at playing that melody, fewer errors, more accurate on that melody compared to another melody. So the same thing happens if your brain is reiterating, rethinking about a skill that you've learned. That's one way you're better at it. Our learning happens when we engage in new activities, but it also happens in our brain as we churn through that information, because we learn so much every day, and all that information has to kind of fit in with what we know, and we don't keep everything. We forget a lot. So we have to kind of figure out what needs to be remembered. One other example here is a habit. This is about implicit social bias. So we behave in particular ways based on gender, based on race, and we can actually, we learn those habits of biases kind of unconsciously, and we can train to get better by exposure to what's called counter stereotypes, the opposite of the typical stereotype. So we had training to reduce the biases, and then there was again a sound that got played during sleep. And as you can see here, the bias reduction was stronger after that sound was played during sleep, and the other bias went back to normal. So again, same story, memory processing during sleep changes our performance when we wake up. And so it leads to the bigger question of, well, what's the brain doing during sleep, as you asked me to begin with? And here's an analogy. Perhaps it's like house elves cleaning your brain while you sleep. And that sounds crazy. It's actually the title of an article I wrote. You can see it if you just Google house elves and sleep, it'll come right up. And so the idea is, well, it's kind of like all those memories come in during the day, and it's a mess, and you have to like clean it up, organize your memories, figure out what's related, what am I going to need to know, what's connected to the problems that I'm experiencing, all these sort of things. What are the emotional things that have happened? So working through memories is a critical part of it. We call that part of memory consolidation. So what's sleep good for? Well, certainly for feeling more rested when you wake up. That's what we want. So bodily restoration, maybe mental restoration, so you can not be sleepy. You can pay attention and not, have your mind wander or just be drowsy. So that's important. But the third one I've listed here is this whole thing we've been studying, kind of a newer entry on the scene. Memory consolidation is a critical benefit. And so learning is something we need to, concentrate on when we're learning new information, but we need to also work with that information. And that happens even when we don't realize it while we're asleep. And what is that good for? Of course, remembering is important, but it's also good for problem solving and creativity, because that's about using our memories and figuring out what's the relevant information to bring up to any particular challenge. So we've been studying that. In fact, with our same kind of experiment, we showed that people can more likely solve a problem that we reminded them of while they were asleep. And so that's pretty interesting to try to improve problem solving in that way. Emotions are also important. I won't spend too much time on that given the time. But one other thing I want to mention also is clearing toxins is a pretty interesting idea of what slow wave sleep might be good for. And there's some evidence for it. That's an ongoing hypothesis being examined. And it could be very important, for things like Alzheimer's diseases or other diseases where you want to sort of clear out your brain toxins and we don't have the same kind of lymphatic system, but maybe there's something like it in the brain that's working during sleep. That's a pretty fascinating idea. And one other thing, how do we know about what's happening during sleep? Well, we also have dreaming, but that's the next topic.
Karen, can you give us some insight on what dream research has produced?
Yeah, great. So I'm sure you've all experienced, you wake up from a night of sleep and sometimes you remember a dream and sometimes you don't. But research suggests that probably actually we're all dreaming multiple times every night, maybe even like some sort of dreaming the entire time. And so there's been some theories of dreaming that have been produced based on these reports that have been given after waking. And so Freud took the cake. He had the, most famous theory at the late 19th century, where dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. So he basically thought that the unconscious mind was so unwieldy and crazy that it had to be disguised in order for the conscious mind to perceive it. And that's what was going on in a dream. Your unconscious mind was doing wish fulfillment, and then it was getting disguised, and you were getting your dream to remember and have consciously. So some more recent studies have also suggested that dreams might work to prepare us for social situations or threatening situations that might occur later on. So it's kind of like these social and threatening situations can take a lot of like complicated decision making, and it's nice if you can prepare for it before it actually happens. And so that's one idea about what dreams are doing. We dream a lot about social and threatening situations. So that's one idea. There's another idea that's been becoming more popular recently, which is that dreams serve to explore weak associations with information that is already in our lexicon. So like when you have a recent memory that comes in, a new memory during the day, you have to, as Ken was talking about, do some work to understand how that fits in with what you know and how it might relate to problems you need to solve or creative solutions you need to think about. And during wake, you're often focused on a task. And even when you're not really going out there and exploring the most, wild associations with new information. But maybe dreaming is the perfect time to do just that. And so maybe that's what dreams are working for. There's another idea that Ken mentioned previously also, that dreams specifically are really helpful for processing emotional memories. So when you're awake and you undergo an experience that's emotional, it's often very useful to remember the contents of that experience and apply what you learned the next day, however, or in the future. However, it's not always adaptive to relive the emotion that you experienced when you underwent that situation. And so in dreams, you often dream about emotional things, but you mix them up with other memories that are less emotional, and that therefore dreams might help you kind of work through those emotional memories. And finally, last theory that's worth mentioning is that dreams could just be random activation from the brainstem that's possibly reflecting some other process, like maybe, your brain's preparing to wake up, so it's just getting activated, and maybe the dream content itself isn't so important after all. So there's all these theories about why we're dreaming, yet it's a little bit, there's not really a scientific consensus on which ones deserve further study, which ones are, really the ones that are really explaining what's happening, and which ones aren't. And that's because of some inherent challenges that dream research has faced. And so one really important challenge in dream research is that it's really difficult to control the content of what somebody's dreaming about. So normally, if you want to do an experiment, you have your control group and the experimental group, and you have, one person do one thing, another group do another thing. But with dream studies, it's so difficult to control what someone's dreaming about. It's really hard to say that this type of dream content relates to this, outcome after waking. So that's one challenge. But then a second really important challenge is that we rely on dream reports that are given after the fact. So if you have a dream and then you report it afterwards, not only has time elapsed, which might mean that your memory is distorted or forgotten, but you're also changing state. You're going from being asleep to being awake. And there's so much difference in brain activity between those two states that it can be quite, of course, information is going to be lost. And so these are some, inherent challenges of dream research. And recently, studies have tried to overcome some of these by using brain decoding. So Ken showed you the PSG, polysomnography, all those electrodes that you put on somebody's head. And so there's been a few studies where they look at the patterns of waves in those electrodes and they try to correlate it with what somebody reported dreaming about. And so they were able to predict with decent success when somebody was dreaming about a face or movement, some general categories, but the method is still a bit crude and it's still constrained by those reports that somebody gave afterwards. So what we were hoping with our study was that we could introduce a new method that would complement these other methods that are already being used, dream reports and brain decoding. And so that brings us to our study that we have done recently, real-time two-way communication during REM sleep.
And this is what we were proposed in that earlier thing. So this is exactly what the Mind Science Foundation helped us with.
And this is just fascinating to me. Karen, can you talk
this is still, sorry, we still have, she's going to walk you through the experiment here.
Oh, excellent.
And then we'll have so this is the key results right now.
Yeah, cool. So there's going to be a picture that comes up. So what we did was basically we waited until people were asleep. And so we could verify that they're asleep because on the left, you can see that somebody's awake, their brain waves are more thick, and those are those blue lines. So each blue line comes from one electrode that's on somebody's head. And so those are the brain waves. And then the red lines are electrodes next to their eyes. So in that way, we can see where their eyes are looking. And then the black line is on their chin, and that allows us to see their muscle tone. So when they're awake, it's a little fuzzier. And then you can see when they're asleep, they're almost completely paralyzed. And so that black line is really thin. The brain waves are definitely sleeping. And we had some experts look and say, okay, yes, they're definitely asleep. And so then during the sleep portion, you can see on the red lines that the participant is making these dramatic eye movements. They're looking left, right, left, right, left, right. And that was a signal we agreed upon before sleep for the participant to tell us that they were aware that they were dreaming and they were trying to communicate to us. So those three red circles is the participant telling us, I'm having a lucid dream. I know that I'm dreaming. So then after seeing that, I'm seeing this come across the screen in the lab, I present a very soft question that's just spoken in my voice, and it is 8 minus 6. And that's the vertical line here. And then the participant, we know that they heard me and answered because there's 2 red circles right here, which means they gave us the answer encoded in eye movements too. And then the other one, we actually asked the same question again and they answered again also too. Yeah. And then the dreamer, we woke them up and they reported being in this dream of their favorite video game, and they realized that they were dreaming and they started falling backwards. And during this time, they heard us ask 8 minus 6, and they remembered answering 2. So this is actually only one. We have 28 more examples of people who are answering questions correctly during REM sleep. And so the paper that we published was a collaborative effort. You can go to the next slide, with lots of other researchers. So there's 4 different labs total that replicated these results. And here's the authors here. And so each team did the study independently, and then we came together to write a paper to really bolster our results. And so the input for the different teams, some asked yes or no questions and asked the dreamers to respond yes or no with different codes. Several teams asked math questions because there's multiple different answers that the dreamer could give. And one team also asked, they tapped the dreamer on the finger and asked, how many times did we tap you on the finger? And then for the output, most teams used eye movements, but there was also an output using facial muscle twitches. So they said, for instance, furrow your brow twice if the answer is yes. And so this is a demonstration that it's possible to have a conversation with somebody while they're dreaming. And we kind of wanted this paper to be in a way, a proof of concept that this is possible, that they could definitely hear you and definitely answer. But what else can dreamers tell us about their dreams? We're not inherently interested in the answers to math problems because we already know the answers. So we're hoping that in future studies, we can ask dreamers questions that we don't know the answers to, such as what they're dreaming about. or even adapting psychology experiments that are done on people who are awake to give them to people while they're asleep so that we can start to characterize the cognitive capacities of this other state of consciousness.
Oh, just amazing. It's thrilling to hear this. And can you tell us, you've talked a lot about lucid dreaming and how you study it scientifically. Can you talk a little bit more about potential, and I know both of you are going to jump in on this, since we've learned about lucid dreaming and I know people are fascinated. Can you tell us about the applications or how you think these methods could be useful for people? And you've kind of already alluded to some of this, but can you kind of wrap that up in a little package?
Yeah. So I thought we'd just start with the applications and, kind of how we induce lucid dreams in the lab. And so a lucid dream, they're notoriously rare if you've ever tried to have one. I think the stats are that about 50% of people will have at least one lucid dream in their life, and only 20% of people have more frequent lucid dreams. And so critically, a lucid dream is when you know that you're dreaming while you're still asleep. So if you wake up and realize that it was a dream afterwards, that's not a lucid dream. It's really different. You're in a dream and you're like, oh my gosh, I know I'm in a dream, and you can make decisions and to some extent control what's going on in the dream. So in our studies, we didn't just want people to have a lucid dream once a month. We need them to have a lucid dream in the next 2 hours while they're wired up in the lab. So we used a method that has been recently developed to induce lucid dreams in our participants before we started asking them questions. So the goal of the method was to basically induce lucid dreams with as little effort as possible. So first, the participants came into the lab for an early morning nap around the time that they normally woke up. And then while we wired them up to electrodes, we just explained what lucid dreaming was and what the experiment that they were going to do was all about. And then while the participant, right before they fell asleep for about 20 minutes, we had participants undergo this training where they associated a sensory cue with a lucid mindset. So there was a flashing light or a beeping sound that sounded like this. Boop, boop, boop. And every time we presented a cue, then we just gave participants this meditation that was like, as you notice the cue, you become lucid. Bring your attention to your thoughts. Notice where your mind has wandered. And it goes on for a bit. And so we tried to just make this strong association. Every time you hear this sound, you become really critically, mindfully aware of yourself and your environment. Then while people fell asleep, we present those cues longer and longer intervals. And then when people fell asleep and entered REM sleep, we presented the cues again. And in this original study, it induces lucid dreams in about 50% of participants that have REM sleep. So we were pretty excited about this. It's basically as good as you're going to get in a lucid dream induction study. And there's been lots of other studies as well that have worked on inducing lucid dreams and different methods for doing that. Some of them are like waking up in the middle of the night, staying awake and going back to sleep, thinking about your dreams and how they're dreaming. So this is another method that we are working on. And so one thing that we're also trying to do is adapt it for people to use at home. So we're not sure it'll work as well as it will in the lab, but we made an Android app where you can do a version of this experiment at home. And so it'll give you the training before you fall asleep, and then it'll wait for a period of time and present cues again while you're sleeping to try to catch you in REM and give you a lucid dream. So if you want and you have an Android, then you could try this out yourself.
Yeah, and so that's one of our applications to get to what you're asking about, Miriam. Our research, the experiment Karen published with all the authors, it's kind of a starting point for a lot more research on dreams, because we have a new way, we can ask people about their dreams when they wake up. We can also ask them about their dreams while they're in the dream. And that allows for a lot of more research about what is the conscious experience of dreaming all about. And so we're looking forward to investigating that, but also some applications that could come out of the laboratory, like this app, like having people use lucid dreaming in their own life. So we could talk about applications for a long time, but I'm going to try to be brief so we can get to some questions from the audience. But just briefly, some of the things are applications for clinical disorders. So people that have difficulties perhaps we can think about ways to help them. And so one category is PTSD, and to a certain extent, depression and other disorders have a sleep problem as part of the symptoms, poor sleep or nightmares in the case of PTSD. And we'd like to find out more about that and figure out ways to improve the situation for them. And so it's kind of like, you know, instead of inputting the meow sound or the boop, boop, boop to get them to lucid dream, it would be moving something that's going to stop the cycle of negative emotions that's coming up, or maybe in the case of some depression, some rumination. If you're ruminating about some negative thoughts, and that's what you do during the day, well, I'm kind of betting that your brain is doing that at night, even though you don't know it, and that's part of the disorder. And if we could unhook that, you know, mostly you think about, well, when I'm sleeping, there's no control over anything. It's, you know, nothing I can change about sleep. Well, no, I think we can change what's happening during sleep. So this is a whole new territory of, can we make sleep more calm or more beneficial for people that are having difficulties with their sleep? So that's one big category of future applications. Another one we've already started working on is with patients that have had a stroke and are trying to regain motor function. And so they use basically rehab therapy to try to get back the fine motor control of an arm, say. And we're working with some neurologists that have been studying that kind of rehab, but asking, can we reinforce the daytime rehab training with additional processing of that learning during sleep? Same kind of learning, you know, it's not spatial learning, but it's muscle control. And that's, you know, you kind of have to do some neural learning to learn how to control your muscles after the stroke has taken out some brain tissue. And so that's pretty interesting if we can improve rehab results through a nighttime therapy kind of added on to the daytime therapy. So we're working on that. And we're also interested in other disorders of sleep like bruxism, which is, you know, teeth grinding. Can you disable, you know, you can put some sort of bite thing to keep you from doing damage to your teeth, but can we actually stop it by getting in there and changing your behavior during sleep? And so that's sort of the hope of these, the targeted memory reactivation, kind of a different spin on that to kind of do that sort of thing. And then on the right side, I have, well, applications that could be for everybody, whether or not you have disorder, because we think, well, maybe there are ways to get more out of sleep to improve your psychological well-being and sort of push your sleep in a different way. And of course, we have to handle the question, you know, is it a good thing to have your sleep be more calm? Or is there a sense in which having anxious dreams is helpful for us? I mean, that's sort of an interesting question. Are anxious sort of horrible dreams, do they serve a purpose, or are they just something we'd like to get rid of? So we'll have to ask that. But now we have the ability to kind of control dreams, perhaps in a little bit, you know, more than we thought before. You know, you can have an intention, and that works a little bit. You can go to sleep right before sleep with an intention to, I'm going to think about the math problems I'm learning, or the problem I'm having in my social world or something. You can do that, but I think adding these sounds gives us more opportunities to do sort of things like that, you know. So another category is anybody that's having nightmares. Maybe you can end them, make people wake up when they're having a nightmare, or maybe make them understand what's causing the nightmare. So that's sort of a lucid dreaming direction that's been looked at by a lot of the lucid dreaming researchers. And now that we can make lucid dreaming happen more often, we can get into that and say, you know, confront the monster in your nightmare and find out what it's doing there, and then make it disappear if it needs to, you know, resolve the problem. And back in the learning realm, you know, improving skills, if you're a highly skilled athlete or musician, maybe a little more practice would get you that extra advantage you want. You could do that in your lucid dream using Karen's method. And these are, you know, these things have been worked on a little bit, but again, we think we can do better by inducing more lucid dreams. So it's problem solving, creativity, as well as skills. There's a whole category of enhancing your spiritual development that's got an ancient history in what's been called dream yoga in the Buddhist tradition. And so that's sort of a very interesting thing to kind of connect to, you know, and they're different goals, of course. Why are they doing dream yoga? It's part of their whole worldview. So that's sort of interesting to think about that. And again, any sort of experience that you can't normally have in the daytime. And when I was in San Antonio, it was like flying like Superman was an example. There might be other things you'd want to do, or maybe you can't do because of some disability. You'd like to try it out in your lucid dreams. So these are interesting ideas for applications. And I think more and more people are studying these things. There's many labs working on it. So I think there's a hope for a whole lot of new things to happen. And again, I want to thank the funding organizations, and I'm featuring the Mind Science Foundation here because of your great help on what we've been doing so far. So thank you to everybody in your organization. And I put up a note for where some of our publications can be freely downloaded. And of course, I'm grateful for all the collaborators, and Karen and I have really had a lot of fun too, working on this project with two-way communication, because that's sort of a big new step that we didn't know would be possible a few years ago, and now it is. So it's opening the door to some new things, and we'd like to talk to you more, Miriam, on any of these topics.
Absolutely, this is really frontier science. Doing things that nobody has done before, things that we thought were not doable or impossible. And I have to comment on the spinning top, because I'm sure the first thing that a lot of people think of when you talk about dreaming or lucid dreams is the movie Inception. So do you want to go down that rabbit hole? Do we want to kick off Q&A with that? If anyone has questions, if you want to put that your questions in the Q&A box. So do you want to start with how realistic Inception is, or?
Well, it's funny because in Inception, what happened is the several characters entered a person's dream, and Karen and I aren't doing that. We're out there in the control room, but the idea of Inception was to put an idea in someone's mind and make them make a decision in a particular way, and that's not so hard. We don't need to enter their dreams. What we need to do is have our sounds go in. And so an ethical question is, should you do that sort of surreptitiously without someone's consent? And, if you're a hotel owner, I suppose you could wait until they're asleep and play messages that say, come to my hotel and don't go to those other hotels. You could do that. We're not sure that's the kind of, advertising that would be right. But it sort of opens the door to what can happen. And in the experiment I told you about with the habit learning, the decreasing your implicit social bias, well, those things don't necessarily work if you're resistant to the idea. So we can learn new things, but it's not quite like just implanting any old idea in people's minds. It sort of has to fit with what they're ready for. So I think the ethical questions are always worth thinking through, trying to understand. But here we are, trying to figure out, well, how can we make someone's memory better for something they want to remember, or improve their skills, or improve their problem solving? And it's only things that they know fully about, and they're on board with trying to get better.
Absolutely. Do we know how the quality of recall in the waking state after a lucid dream compares to recall after a non-lucid dream?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And a big issue is that it's difficult to study that, because in neither case, do you really have a record of what happened in the dream? So it could be that lucid dreams are more vividly recalled because they're more vivid, or because it's the recall. But an interesting note is that we've looked into it recently. There are definitely a few cases in which people gave lucid eye signals and didn't remember anything. So it does seem like people remember lucid dreams better, but it doesn't seem like they're immune to forgetting either.
Yeah, that's a really striking finding, because you might have, before that finding from Karen, you might have thought, well, we forget many of our dreams, but if we have a lucid dream, we totally remember that, because, well, every time we remember a lucid dream, it's proof. But now we know, no, actually, there are lucid dreams people have, and they wake up and they might not remember that they had it, because we could demonstrate that with our eye movements signals. At least, it seems like they knew it was a dream at the time they made the signal. And then, some minutes passed before we woke them up, too many, because we didn't want them to forget, but enough minutes passed that by then they didn't remember that part of the dream. So the question is, well, what has to happen for you to remember a dream? Well, I guess my answer, if I was going to guess, was you have to wake up soon enough after the dream. And that's a little tricky, because you can have a micro arousal. You can wake up a little bit and then go back to sleep and forget, not really notice that you did that. And is that enough to remember a dream? And what about where there's some delay? Because sometimes sometimes you remember a dream right in the morning, and sometimes later in the day it comes to you. So is that, so we have a lot to explain. So there are a lot of mysteries about dreaming.
Absolutely. And I also, I'm sure a lot of us have heard that advice to, the first thing when you wake up in the morning is write down your dream in a dream journal. But what you just said also is that if you have insights later in the day, are you actually remembering the dream, or is that your waking interpretation layered on top of the dream?
There's this interesting idea about dream recall that I kind of like, which is like, normally when you're recalling something, you have like a post in that memory, right? You have like, oh yeah, like I'm going to remember that because here's my grocery list, or something jogs your memory. And in dreams, it can be difficult you can't bring anything with you. So what can jog your memory? I think that this kind of stuff could be suited for like an interesting experiment. Like maybe it's that the only reason that dream recall is bad is because you just don't have any guideposts to remember it, unless you can bring something with you when you wake up, or maybe later in the day, something jogs your memory that was in your dream. So that's kind of a different idea than the one Ken was talking about, but another option.
And why do we remember some dreams so vividly and not others?
Karen?
Probably the same reason, right? If I'm going to extrapolate, there was an interesting series of studies on like some different brain regions that are going on when you're dreaming, and like there might be like, it might relate to some different brain activity that's going on. Like maybe there's a certain part of your brain that needs to be active in order for you to remember a dream, and that's how you're going to remember it. And there's another series of studies about how kind of like what Ken was saying, how activated part of your brain is when you're sleeping. And maybe that just, I guess that sounds similar, but it's different. Maybe that relates to why you're remembering a dream, because you're closer to waking up or something like that. You have more of certain neuromodulators.
Yeah. And another big question about dreaming is it important to remember it? In other words, is there some value to dreaming for our brain function? Does it make our brain work better? Does it make us, behave better the next day? Is it a useful thing, or is it just like entertainment? And probably it's useful, but we're still, the theories that Karen mentioned are trying to figure that out, but none of them really say, in order for it to be useful, you have to remember the dream. It's maybe just the memory, for the memory point of view, it's the memory organization that happens by virtue of putting these random things together and seeing how they fit. And that's useful for you. And it's not about if you remember it or not that makes it helpful for you.
Oh, that's
a
interesting.
possibility.
I hadn't thought of that. Can you relate, or does hypnosis in any way relate to lucid dreaming?
Well, hypnosis has definitely been used to try to induce lucid dreams, and it doesn't seem to be like super effective, but it's kind of interesting to think about like the similarities between the states. Like in hypnosis, you are probably awake, but your inhibition is really relaxed. So like you might be more suggestible if you're like a hypnotizable person. And in lucid dreaming, you're not awake, you're in a REM sleep. So your senses are a lot more diminished in terms of the outside. And it's a little unclear what's going on with the inhibition in terms of hypnosis. It might be really different because you're there, you are critically evaluating your environment, and that's pretty different from hypnosis, but it's interesting to think about how they're similar and different. Maybe there's other overlaps I haven't thought of.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's not quite so critical because, I'm not much of a lucid dreamer. So I have dreams and I think, why didn't I realize that was a dream? But, in the context of a dream, I'm just going about what's ever happening and not getting that critical attitude that Karen is talking about, of saying, well, wait a minute, let me think about my experience now. It's not what I tend to do in dreams. Most people, I think that's true.
Right, maybe not in a regular dream. Maybe hypnosis is more like a regular dream.
Yeah.
So, and here's something that I've always wondered about. So if you have a dream, and not talking about a lucid dream, but just a regular dream, does your brain experience that as the same reality? If I'm being chased in a dream, and this just shared something there. If I'm being chased in a dream and the fear that is experienced, does the brain receive that as as real as if it were happening in real life?
That's chaste, C-H-A-S-T-E. No.
Of course, yeah.
Actually, Karen's asking some questions just like that about, what happens when you are doing things in your dream, and we're measuring brain activity to like to see. So here's an example. When you close your eyes and you're awake and you get into a relaxed state, you have lots of alpha activity over the back of your head. It's your visual system kind of changing its state as there's no input. And so she's doing an experiment where she's trying to figure out, well, if you're in a lucid dream or non-lucid dream and you close your eyes, does that also make your visual cortex behave that way or nothing? So, there's a whole set of experiments like that where we want to ask, well, how is dreaming different from waking? If that's kind of the meat of your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then going back to talking about reinforcing learning, and you touched on the ethical considerations. So ethical considerations aside, if this is all wanting to learn a new skill or reinforce that, can you introduce new material into somebody's lucid dream where they might learn, like if you didn't know how to play guitar and you introduce that, or you did, something like that where there's no ethical concerns. It's just a dreamer learning new material.
Can I start the answer and then I'll give it to you, Karen? So
Yeah.
Part of the answer is, well, what did people think before Karen's study? And the answer was, from the 50s on, people thought you can't learn new things during sleep. In the old fairy tales and fiction, the idea that you could just get a new foreign language by learning in your sleep was debunked. And then there were a few studies showing, well, actually a little learning happens, and it's like conditioning and just, associating two odors together. That can happen during sleep, but not like remembering spatial locations or whole episodes. But Karen has another example.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, you can learn 8 minus 6. So like it's kind of like recalling a dream, right? Like if you have a dream and you recall it, then I guess you learned it, but the information was internally generated. So if you can introduce new information into a dream, then maybe you could wake it up and remember that as well.
And so she proved that people, her subject woke up and said, well, I was asleep and you asked me 8 minus 7 and 8 minus 6, and I answered 2. He totally learned that. And that's not conditioning. That's a full-blown, recollection of information. So therefore, in a lucid dream, it's possible to learn stuff that comes in from the outside and then wake up and know that information. So we have a counterexample to the orthodoxy, which said not much learning happens during sleep. So now we still have to figure out, well, that's not always true. So what makes that work, and how come it doesn't? Sometimes people don't remember the dream, as we've been talking about.
Certainly a fertile field for study. I have a question here from Rachel, and I'm going to read it verbatim to make sure I get all of the nuance. One of the theories for why EMDR works in reprocessing traumatic memories is that the eye movements done by the patient mimic the eye movements in REM sleep and memory processing during sleep. Could this research get us any closer to proving or disproving that, or understanding how and why EMDR helps trauma patients?
Yeah, Karen, I'll go ahead and start. That there's sort of two separate questions, and one is, does EMDR work? And the other is, and does that have something to do with REM sleep? So I think whether it has something to do with REM sleep is still pretty much up in the air. But there are some studies showing it being effective, and actually there's someone using the TMR method with that exact thing. So this is a group in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and they have patients that are getting this EMDR therapy where they have to move their eyes in the context of a clinical session, and there's sounds that play at the same time. And those sounds are played again during sleep to see if they could enhance the ability of this therapy to work. So that's sort of, I guess, let me scroll back to the question. So could this research get us any closer to proving or disproving how it works? So I guess right now that experiment is about trying to make it work better. And I suppose in the context of that, understanding how it works might sort of get explained a little bit. And I guess the connection between REM sleep could be explored more. But you know, that's like the first study in Amsterdam that's been done on that topic. But the door is open now for you know, and I know at least one other group that wants to do something like that. So we will get perhaps closer and figure out what the connection is. And I think you know, the related bigger issue is how can sleep help people with problems that are, you know, like in PTSD that are already bothering their sleep to a great deal. And EMDR is sort of one of the therapies that's still, you know, out there as potentially useful for unknown reasons that are still debated.
Yeah, I would say the other hypothesis I heard was that EMDR could be because you're just doing something distracting, and so then your attention is divided and you're not completely reliving the trauma as much. And so I guess there's some studies you could do even without, I'm sure that they're doing control studies where you do other tasks besides move your eyes. But I just wanted to say that it is like a huge mystery why you have eye movements during REM sleep. Like it's really unclear like what they're doing and why you have them and what they might be good for and not good for. So the connection is an interesting one.
Yeah, my supposition is that during REM sleep, you're sort of experiencing these, you know, activities, and your muscles have to be shut down, or else you're going to be, you know, slapping around in the bed and causing trouble. So there's all this muscle atonia, but you're not going to do any damage by moving your eyes. So your eyes are free to move, and your heart has to beat, and your respiration has to keep going. So I think the eyes moving is just that there's no harm done by moving your eyes during your sleep, but there is potential harm for the rest of the body. So that's just sort of an idea, but I think there's more to say about, well, can we learn something about the effectiveness of REM sleep for anything? Because it's still, you know, when I was telling you my story about memory consolidation, the studies so far have mostly focused on slow wave sleep, or what's called deep sleep, because the results are clear cut and it's sort of beneficial for memory. The data on REM, well, sometimes it's helpful for forgetting, sometimes for remembering. I think we just don't have a handle on it yet. So it's probably got a pretty interesting role, but it's not a simple role. So it hasn't been easy to kind of understand it. You know, I think in the 80s, people were talking about REM and memory, and it kind of you know, dissipated because the results just didn't show that REM helped memory. And now we're saying, well, slow wave sleep, definitely important for memory. REM, maybe not, maybe a little bit of both.
So there's kind of a related question here from Judy. And you've already touched on it a little bit, but when you're having a dream where you want to cry out or call for help, and so you're like you said, you're paralyzed except for your eyes. But finally you manage to utter some noise. And I think we've all woken ourselves up out of a dream. So I'm assuming that you've proceeded out of REM sleep and to a point where you're able to move or vocalize.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, you would really need PSG to really say that. So like, it's probably true that that's probably what's happening. Sleep talking is something that usually happens during deep sleep, not REM sleep, because of the paralysis. But there are a few examples, like our Dutch collaborators, they asked a participant a math problem and they like mumbled during REM sleep. And so you can have these little breaks in your paralysis where you can maybe say stuff. And it also seems like sleep states aren't as black and white as they are initially made out to be. So like, it could be that, you know, we've seen sometimes where people are still paralyzed, but their brain looks awake, or sometimes their brain looks asleep, but maybe their chin muscle is moving a little bit. So it could be a mixed state, or it could be that you've fully woken up. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Let's see here. Oh, here's a great question. In the context of a lab, is it possible that two participants dreaming can communicate to each other in some way?
We can totally arrange that.
Yeah.
You want to go, Karen? Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So here's our answer for this, which is that hasn't been demonstrated yet, but it could be demonstrated, right? So one example is that you could just hook both participants up to PSG, have one give an eye signal, have them, and then use that to transmit a message from the physical world to the other dreamer. And that's one that doesn't require any mysticism.
Yeah,
But then
let me just expand on how that would be done. So right now, when Karen asks the question 8 minus 6, she actually doesn't use a microphone. She presses a button on the computer that picks a pre-recorded message. So basically, we can have the computer have pre-recorded messages, and then the computer also see the eye movement. So it's just those red signals. When the eye movement comes in, that could tell your computer, or actually your cell phone, it could tell your cell phone to go do something else, like send a message to the other person sleeping. So basically, you could automate. Right now, we're doing two-way interaction with an experimenter, actually running a computer and a dreamer, and they could interact with each other. But you could have two dreamers interact with the same way if it's kind of automated. When the signal comes in, the computer does a thing, says hello from the first dreamer to the second dreamer. So they could communicate with their eyes moving, making the computer give a signal to the other person. And that would be two-way communication between two dreamers. It seems totally feasible, not necessarily easy, because you have to have both lucid dreaming and have the computers arranged as such, but totally within the realm of what our experiment shows could be done.
And then there's a continuation of that, which is that if you wanted to see if, two people in dreamland could interact with each other without the physical world intervening, then if you had those two people in a lucid dream in either room, one in PSG over here, one in PSG over here, and you had them lucid dream at the same time, you could say, okay, meet me, in the lab in the middle or in some defined location in the dream. And then you could have a dreamer, like, this is an experiment that someone else thought of, but like you could have them trace a shape with their finger and have both dreamers follow it. And then you would be able to demonstrate, if that really works, that both dreamers were looking at the same thing in their respective dreams. So nobody's done that yet, but it could be tested.
Yeah, and that's someone else's Stephen LaBerge, who has been historically doing great research for decades on this stuff. And so he gets that question all the time, and that's his answer.
Yeah.
So is there an application or a clinical application for that? Or is it more just because we're fascinated by the idea of communicating in another state?
You mean between dreamers specifically, or like experimenter to dreamer?
No, dreamer to dreamer. Is there would that tell you something that you wouldn't know about the brain that?
Well, I think the mystical answer would tell you quite a bit, but the other answer, I can't really think of what that would actually be good for, other than just like a super fun thing to do. Can you think of anything? Because people ask me that, but I never actually was understood why that was super cool. Unless
I guess the reason is it's fascinating to imagine that we could meet our friends and other people in a dream world, and there are always other characters in our dream world. I mean, we always have other characters, and as Karen was pointing out the other day, sometimes they know it's a dream too. It's never happened to me, but when in my dreams, I don't know it's a dream, and nobody else tells me it's a dream. But apparently, sometimes the other characters could do that, and so then it's easy to just go a step from that and think, well, could those be actual people in their dreams and my dreams, and we've all met in the same place? And that that doesn't fit with any explanation we can give at the moment. So that's why it seems far-fetched. But until we give it a try, we haven't. In fact, we can't really rule it out.
So Ernie asks, I understand that one reason we don't question our dream content as unusual is that our prefrontal cortex is less active during dreaming. Is that true?
So parts of your prefrontal cortex seem to be less active than wake during dreaming, but other parts seem not to be. But the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the side that has to do with different things, including having a lot of goals within one another and holding information in mind for a long period of time, that seems to be less active than when you're awake, but more active than in other stages of sleep. So it's not completely shut off.
Okay. Is there any research about embedded dreams, i.e. having a dream, waking up and realizing it was a dream within the dream, but in fact, you're still dreaming and the real waking follows up, wakes up.
Yeah, sometimes that's called a false awakening. So you dream about waking up and it seems like you woke up, but then actually you hadn't.
Yeah. So there's not any clear evidence that you're more dreaming in the dream that you're dreaming of. It's not like you're in like double REM sleep or something like that, but it is kind of interesting that sometimes we can see that with eye signals, like somebody will be asleep and we have a signal that says I'm awake, and sometimes somebody will be asleep and they'll give the signal for I'm awake. And so we're trying to use two-way communication to like surmount that difficulty, because false awakenings are common in lucid dreaming research. So like if somebody were to give us a signal for I'm awake, we might say like, no, you're not.
You're not.
Like do a check.
Yeah, that's anyway. So we've documented that. I mean, people have reported that experience a lot. But it's sort of interesting if Karen's looking at the PSG data, the scrolling down, and they, this person's in REM sleep, and then they give the signal that says, I'm awake now, because we decided the signal. Well, either they messed up the signal or they really think they woke up and they didn't. And so that totally happens. So there's some scope for looking at that. And I don't know, Karen, can you say, why does that happen? I mean, it's just, your dreams can be anything. So why not dream about waking up and then something else could happen?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that it happens in lucid dreaming research a lot. And I think that maybe it's because a lucid dream can be so unstable, you're always trying not to wake up. And so if it ends or something, then your mind might be like, oh, well, I'm waking up, but like you're not actually. But it's interesting to think about why you would have a dream of waking up. Yeah.
Is there any correlation between self-control or inhibitory control and the ability to exert control in a lucid dream?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, there's definitely like a dimension of control in a lucid dream. Like you can have like different levels of insight into the fact that you're dreaming. Like, oh, I really know that I'm dreaming right now, but sometimes you still can't control it. And sometimes you can control it a lot more. So it's interesting to think about what that might be related to while you're awake. And I'm not sure that it's related to your personal inhibitory self-control, although I'm not sure it's been extensively looked at. I usually think that dream control improves with practice, and it might be required a different kind of cognitive control. You really have to like manipulate your underlying deep beliefs. Like often if you're in a dream and you try to control something superficially, but you doubt it, then it won't work. But if you really believe it, then it will work. So I don't know what that would relate to during wake.
Yeah, from my point of view, there's a big context for that, because there's sort of the question of, well, what makes someone good at having a lucid dream? And then what makes someone who can have a lucid dream also good at controlling the dream and, being the director of the movie and making exactly what they want to make happen? And the research on that has been limited. So, the labs across the world that have been studying lucid dreams, they've had this trouble where you get, you find people that are good lucid dreamers and you bring them into the lab so you can do these experiments, but they don't necessarily have a lucid dream. And so it's been very frustrating for them. And some of them, like Ursula Voss in Germany, she kind of said, well, I need to find out a method to make lucid dreams happen more often. That's the only way I can do this research. So they've been struggling for a method like that. And I think the method we've used and our collaborators in Europe have used, now opening the door to, well, if we can make 50% of the people that have REM sleep in the lab have a lucid dream, we can ask these questions now. So I think it wasn't really possible to do much research on this area because the phenomenon was so rare and uncontrollable. And so my hope is, now that it's controlled, we can kind of ask, this is an interesting question. I think it remains to be asked, but now we have the means to maybe get at that kind of question. And it's kind of related. I think her question about self-control, it's sort of like when you're controlling your lucid dream, how does that translate to your waking life? I mean, what kind of control could you have in your waking life that says, now I have some mastery over what's going on? And we kind of want that in our waking life, not so we can just make anything happen, but so that we have, control of how we react to stuff. So when someone gets mad at you, do you get mad right away back? And, do you kind of have the ability to decide how you're going to treat people in any situation, or are you just overcome by whatever impulse kind of happens, which is what our non-lucid dreams are like, I guess. And so that's sort of like being lucid while you're awake is a kind of a nice goal too. And maybe it's related to what Brianna was asking about.
So as we come close to wrapping things up here right at 7 o'clock, we have time for a few more, but also do you have any advice or prescriptions for those of us who want to try and develop lucid dreaming in our own lives?
Yeah, so there's a lot of resources available for people who are interested in having lucid dreams. There's some classic books. Exploring the World of Lucid Dreaming is the most like classic lucid dreaming book that also has some research in it. One of my favorite books is A Field Guide to Lucid Dreaming. I just think it's really fun, and it's just about different ways to have lucid dreams. It's kind of interesting, like we tried to develop this method to have lucid dreams in a really contained period of time, but a lot of the methods usually like require, or just they work better if you think a lot about lucid dreams and you read a lot about lucid dreams, and that can, just doing those things can help you have a lucid dream on their own. And so even just from listening to this, you might have a lucid dream. That's pretty common. And so, yeah, but you could look it up. There's lots of advice. There's different techniques one's called mild mnemonic induction of lucid dreams. And so the dream journal technique you mentioned is I think a good predecessor for all of them. I keep a dream journal. It's so fun. And my phone. So yeah, I hope that's.
Yeah, I think that is the thing, that the known methods that have been around and developed all require a fair amount of effort. Like, right. At least for me, I mean, Karen says it's fun, but I've tried keeping a dream journal, and I just, I want to wake up and get going. It's sort of, so if you have the patience to go, think about your dreams every morning and write a dream journal. And I found actually when I started doing it, it was interesting, because when you first wake up, my first thought was, oh, I don't remember any dreams, just get up. But actually, if you sit a little bit, keep your eyes closed, don't do anything, but lay there and try to remember the dream. Sometimes in a half a minute, it comes. And then you say, oh, now actually, I remember a lot more than I did. So as soon as you get up, open your eyes, start your day, that kind of pushes the dream back. So writing a dream journal and kind of working on when you wake up in the morning is kind of, if you care to do it, is kind of the way to really make your dreams become a more important part of your life. And then you're constantly thinking during the day, oh, I have to do a reality check and think, am I dreaming now or am I awake? And you get in the habit of doing that while you're awake. So some of the little suggestions are, like look at a clock and look away and then look back and notice if the time is totally different, that might be it's because you're in a dream, or look at a word and look away and look back. And if the word changes, that's a sign. Or, some people say, jump up and see if you float gradually down to the floor, or, see if you can put your finger through your palm. And if you can, that, so you do these things, do these little checks, and you get into the habit of doing that. Then maybe in your dream, that habit pervades and you do that habit and you can do a lucid dream. So, our app is the other recommendation, and it's kind of the shortcut, without my idea is, well, without any effort, without doing all that other stuff, you could have a shortcut into having a lucid dream. Our app, if we get it to work better, it's not working like we want it to, but if we develop these methods in the lab and then get them out, maybe we have a shortcut for having a lucid dream without all the extra effort. But in the meantime, all those effortful things are kind of the way to go.
Super. Well, I think we're going to end with a question from Rita that I love. We haven't talked about it, but what about other mammals dreaming? What do we know about that, or can we know that? Do other mammals dream?
Well, the original studies of...
Please go.
Sorry, I was just going to say, the original studies of like how we're paralyzed in sleep were done on cats. So they like cut out the part of your brainstem that paralyzes somebody while they're asleep, and the cats, while they were asleep, like pounced on things and like ran around, but like the things weren't really there. So it seemed like cats possibly dream. And the their observations was that the cats dreamed about like predatory behavior. So I assume that it's more than just cats and humans. I guess you could say that maybe that's not associated with the dream, but I don't think so. I don't know what you think, Ken.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of arguments that rodents are also dreaming, and I think, you know, if anyone has a dog, you kind of see this behavior that looks like running or like a muffled bark. So, you know, that and the physiology of the brain is similar enough in mammals that it looks like something similar is happening. All mammals seem to have REM sleep and non-REM sleep, with maybe the exception of echidna. So very early on in the mammalian line, it seems like there might have been the beginnings of REM sleep, although that's even controversial. So it seems like it's pretty common in mammalians, and then we have to ask about other species. It's a little harder. But I've always been wondering, you know, when my dog is dreaming, what is she dreaming about? I'd like to know. And when she wakes up, does she know that that was an imaginary event, and now she's in the real world, and these things matter? I mean, if she, you know, because we have that issue, you know, if you remembered all your dreams and thought they were things that really happened, you know, you might be mad at people that you shouldn't be mad at, or, you know, you'd have all kinds of mistaken episodes in your life. So we kind of segregate them as that's the dream world. But I don't know if my dog can do that, or how does she think about those if she's having dreams? So yeah, cool questions about other dreams and other beings.
Well, I just want to thank you both so much. We're so just thrilled to have been even play a little part in this work. And thank you for enlightening us. And I'm going to go home and I'm going to give it a shot. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.